Greetings everyone. In today's video we're going to be learning about the Catalan opening, and I'm going to teach you how to tackle that very common opening at even the World Championship level with the black pieces. So it typically starts after white plays d4, we're going to be playing knight f6, and after c4, e6, our opponents are going to be transitioning into the Catalan opening with the move g3. So what's interesting is that black typically after knight c3 will play bishop b4, transitioning into the Nimzo opening defense, and after knight to f3, they're going to be playing b6, transitioning into so-called Queen's Indian defense. So in order for white to avoid these systems, they start playing g3 right at this moment. As right now after black plays b6 and seemingly wants to fianchetto the light square bishop on this beautiful long diagonal, white is the first one to put the bishop there. And that will force either black to play a move like knight to c6 or d5. After cd, for example, and pawn d5, the light square bishop of blacks is going to be not as effective and not as active as in most other Nimzo or Queen's Indian setups. So after g3, what black is going to be playing is d5, simply transitioning into this Queen's Gambit decline setup. It's also possible to start with d5, then play e6 and knight f6 in order to reach this position. So what is the idea behind the Catalan for white? We could make another move, bishop g2 or knight f3 here, doesn't really matter. But it seems like white is going away from the typical setup where the light square bishop is going to help and defend the c4 pawn, which black sometimes can take. So the idea behind it is that white is playing this as a gambit and transitioning the bishop to g2 diagonal when the black's light square bishop is stuck behind the pawn chain. Black has three main ways of playing this. They could be playing it in the so-called closed way, where black is going to be putting this pawn on c6. Typically, white loves to play against that. For example, knight f3, we could play many different moves like bishop d6 or bishop e7 or knight to d7. And in general, it's considered to be very favorable for white, as they don't have to memorize as much theory. We could simply strike in the center with moves like queen c2, knight d2, and quick e4. And even though many players with the black pieces love to play this system at club level player, from my experience, most people say that this is their favorite variation to play with the white pieces because of having very little risk. So that would be one way to play against the Catalan with the black pieces. Now the other way is probably the most classical way, which is to take the pawn on c4, and while white is trying to win the pawn back, we're going to be solving the problem of our light square bishop. So for example, we play bishop e7, knight f3, castles, castles, and at this point they take on c4. Now white has two main moves over here, which is knight e5 and queen c2. If we start covering moves like knight e5, then the video would just be too long. But the general idea is that while white is trying to win the pawn back, we're going to solve the problem of our light square bishop. So for example, if they take on c4, we can play b5 and bam, we have time to play our bishop to b7, and at least one biggest problem in the Catalan defense, which is our light square bishop, has been solved. A moment before, if they try to stop b5 with the move a4, we can still play bishop d7 and then get that bishop onto the long diagonal with bishop to c6. Of course, white still fights for a small edge here, but as the world champion Vladimir Kramnik said, he couldn't find an advantage objectively here for the white pieces. And the third way of playing the Catalan with the black pieces, and I think this is the most annoying typically for white, is when black is trying to take the pawn and hold on to that. So what we're going to be playing at this moment is taking on c4. If they had played knight f3 instead of bishop g2, this would just transpose in the position we see in front of us. And after knight f3, we're going to be going bishop to b4 check. So there are a couple of ways that they could be playing. Bishop d2 is considered to be the absolute main line, but we could briefly take a look at knight to c3, with typically just castle, castle, and play the move knight to c6, applying pressure on d4. It seems like why are we applying pressure here, as this is guarded enough, but it typically prevents knight e5 by white, as we're threatening d4. And knight e5 is a very common move in the Catalan for white, where they would be attacking the c4 pawn as well as opening up the light square bishop. For example, they could be playing a3, it's possible to take or go back, for example, say bishop e7, and after a move like e4 where they're trying to compensate with the pawn center in the middle for the lack of pawn on the other side, we're just going to be preparing this a6, b5, bishop b7, and even knight a5 move if needed in order to aim at the b3 square and support the pawn on c4. So for example, some games have seen bishop e3, and after b5, we're transitioning into a better position for black already. As we go back, the move that you will 100% see, or most likely the move you're going to see, is bishop to d2 over here. And at this point, we're going to be playing the move a5, supporting this bishop with the pawn. Of course, if they take, we're very happy. We get the rook open into the game, so it's very, very rare for people to be doing this exchange. And most of the time, people will either castle or play the move queen to c2. Now, if they castle, typically we castle as well. And now, since they have unpinned their bishop, they want to play bishop g5 and make an argument that our bishop here is misplaced. So they're amending simply the misplaced bishop on d2. So the typical line is h6. Example, takes, queen to c2, applying the pressure on the c4 pawn. And in this position, there are a couple of ways that we could play. I recommend simply knight c6 once again, applying pressure on the d4 pawn. After queen c4, we can strike with e5. We have pawn to d5 as the main move, and you can make a draw here or equalize like a grandmaster after a couple of moves. So bishop to d6, and this position has been seen a couple of times. Black has equality. As we're going back, instead of castling here, which we have observed, the main move is queen c2 and directly applying the pressure on c4. At this point, we're going to be taking, and simply if they play knight takes, we're allowed to play b5 and hold to the pawn with the structure with b5 and c6. So white has perhaps some kind of compensation with the double pawns of blacks and possibilities of later expanding maybe even the center with e4 or breaking the structure on the queen side with b3. But black is a pawn up, and it is considered that the position is very fighting and promises black to play for a win here as well. Instead, queen d2 is the main move for a very funny reason, that after the move c6 and b5, black sometimes can run into ideas of queen to g5. So if we, for example, played b5 here, after takes and takes, there's a move queen to g5, and that's the idea behind the move queen takes d2. So instead of we're going to be playing knight to e4, after queen f4, we're going to go queen b6 with pressure on b6. Castles, queen takes b2, and we'll get into this madness where we have very good chances to play for a win, as well as, of course, lose the game when you're playing for the win. But I think that it's almost unlikely, no chance that you're going to ever get to this position, as your opponent simply won't know enough theory. I promise you a fighting position, and I believe that you will have great winning rate with this repertoire with the black pieces, as this is far away from the main line. But I think objectively, this is holdable even at the very highest level with the machines and all that. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson on the Catalan. If you did, consider hiring me as your personal online chess coach. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.